Gold, once the metal that crowned empires and brought entire economies to their knees, is now shaking the foundations of global power in West Africa. Today, the key to that power rests with President Assimi Goïta of Mali. He stands shoulder to shoulder with President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso in a bold effort to reclaim control over a resource that, in previous decades, yielded more than 75 metric tons of gold annually for Mali, while the majority of wealth vanished into the vaults of Toronto, Paris, and Sydney. Why are Goïta and Traoré now featured prominently in Africa, news not as fringe insurgents, but as visionary national leaders forging a new strategy for sovereignty? What detailed plans are they negotiating behind closed doors? Plans that could reduce Mali's dependency on foreign gold buyers, restructure government royalty revenue from a low of 6% per ton, and redirect profits back to state coffers? This is not merely about minerals. It is about dignity and economic self-determination. With President Assimi Goïta in Mali and President Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso cooperating closely, the Sahel is transitioning from a region of reliance to one of regional negotiation and strategic planning. If you believe this awakening marks a genuine turning point for Africa, please subscribe and stay with us, because the story you are about to hear may fundamentally reshape the world's understanding of power and wealth. Mali, one of Africa's top gold producers, has entered a period of dramatic transformation. According to the Ministry of Mines, industrial gold output dropped sharply by 23% in the year 2024, falling from 66.5 tons in 2021 to just 51 tons in 2024. This decline did not happen by chance. It followed a sweeping mining code reform introduced by President Assimi Goïta in the year 2023, which raised royalty rates from 6% to 10.5% and granted the state the right to hold up to 35% ownership in all new mining projects. The reform shook the mining sector. One of the world's largest operators, Barrick Gold, suspended its activities in the Loulo-Gounkoto complex after Malian authorities seized 3 tons of gold from its reserve facilities and detained senior staff members during an aerial operation. Other foreign companies also faced unprecedented scrutiny as the government launched audits into contracts signed under previous administrations, many of which had been negotiated under debt pressure or diplomatic coercion. Despite industry alarm, Goïta's administration argued that the reforms were long overdue. Gold accounts for nearly 80% of Mali's export revenue. Yet for decades, the majority of profits flowed abroad to refineries and banks in Toronto, Paris, and Sydney, while local communities remained in poverty. By enforcing higher royalties and majority national stakes, the Malian government sought to reverse this imbalance and keep more wealth within the country. Official data reflected both the costs and the promise of this approach. Including artisanal production, total gold output reached 58.7 tons in 2024. Meanwhile, national gold reserves decreased by 17% between 2022 and 2024, standing at 731 tons. The largest single deposit remained the Sayama mine, operated by Resolute Mining, with reserves of 141 tons. These numbers underscored both Mali's continued global significance and its urgent need for domestic control. Yet this struggle is not happening in isolation. The reforms in Mali, spearheaded by President Assimi Goïta, quickly inspired solidarity from neighboring Burkina Faso under President Ibrahim Traoré and from Niger, setting the stage for a regional awakening. But this is only the surface of the iceberg. The real battle lies ahead, where symbolism collides with geopolitics, and every ounce of gold carries the weight of sovereignty. The turning point came when President Assimi Goïta of Mali declared that foreign companies could no longer dictate the terms of extraction in West Africa's richest goldfields. His government not only audited old contracts but threatened to revoke licenses unless companies agreed to new conditions of national ownership and in-country refining. That single act transformed the Sahel from a region viewed as dependent into a region seen as defiant. At that precise moment, Burkina Faso, under the leadership of President Ibrahim Traoré, stepped onto the stage. Traoré, who had already built a reputation for his uncompromising stance against external interference, declared that Burkina Faso would not only support Mali, but adopt similar measures in its own resource policies. Together with Niger, they announced the creation of the Alliance of Sahel States in late 2023, a regional bloc designed to protect sovereignty, defend natural resources, and coordinate security. This alliance was not symbolic. It carried immediate consequences. By standing with Goïta, President Traoré gave Mali's reforms a shield of legitimacy and regional strength. For decades, critics had dismissed any single African government that challenged global powers as unstable or isolationist. But now, the world was faced with a coalition. Mali held gold, Niger possessed uranium, and Burkina Faso was emerging as a hub for lithium. Each resource was critical not only for African development, but for the global energy transition. The decision to unite shook confidence in the old order. Investors who once relied on uninterrupted flows of minerals suddenly confronted the reality that contracts could be cancelled, royalties raised, and extraction delayed. International markets began pricing in uncertainty, while African news outlets covered the story with a tone of pride. Ordinary citizens in Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey filled public squares with rallies supporting their leaders, waving flags and chanting for independence. This was the climax of a decades-long story. For the first time in generations, West African leaders stood together, declaring that the wealth beneath their soil would no longer serve as collateral for foreign economies. Instead, it would fund their own schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. But such defiance did not go unanswered. The international reaction came swiftly, and with it, the full weight of Western political and economic pressure. The backlash from Western powers was immediate and intense. France, the former colonial ruler, reacted with a mixture of outrage and panic. When Mali, supported by President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, began canceling long-standing mining contracts and demanding in-country refining, Paris saw more than just a financial challenge. It saw an existential threat to its influence across Francophone Africa. French diplomats issued harsh rebukes, warning that Mali and Burkina Faso were destabilizing the region. State-funded media outlets in Paris began portraying Assimi Goïta and Ibrahim Traoré as reckless soldiers, more concerned with power than with the well-being of their people. But beyond the headlines, economic weapons were quietly deployed. Ratings agencies downgraded Mali's credit standing, citing political instability. Even as the country sought to strengthen its financial independence, the European Union froze certain aid transfers, using development assistance as leverage. Meanwhile, the United States think tanks published reports labeling the Alliance of Sahel States as a nationalist experiment that could threaten global markets. These reactions revealed a deeper fear. Gold from Mali accounted for nearly 80% of the country's exports, while uranium from Niger powered reactors in Europe, and lithium from Burkina Faso became vital for electric car batteries. Together, these resources represented not only local wealth, but also global leverage. If Goïta and Traoré succeeded in controlling these supply chains, Western economies could face soaring costs and disrupted access to critical minerals. On the ground, Western influence took a visible hit. Mali expelled the French ambassador and shut down French radio and television broadcasts, cutting off a key channel of Parisian soft power. Burkina Faso followed suit, pushing out French military bases and signaling that its loyalty would no longer be taken for granted. African news outlets across the continent reported these moves with headlines celebrating a new age of defiance. Yet the Western strategy was not purely confrontational. Humanitarian organizations and non-governmental agencies, many with foreign funding, began amplifying reports of protests and shortages in the Sahel, painting a picture of chaos. Opposition groups received sudden attention in international media, and social networks saw a surge of foreign-sponsored campaigns calling for restored democracy. For Goïta and Traoré, the message was clear. The world's most powerful states were not only watching, but actively resisting their revolution. And the question looming over the Sahel was whether the alliance of Mali and Burkina Faso could withstand the storm that had only just begun. For ordinary people in Mali and Burkina Faso, the changes initiated by President Assimi Goïta and President Ibrahim Traoré were more than policy announcements. They represented a new sense of ownership over resources that had long felt stolen. In villages near gold mines, where decades of foreign-operated extraction had left pollution and poverty, people began to notice subtle but meaningful shifts. Local workers were trained to handle refining processes, a task once reserved for technicians flown in from Europe or Canada. Communities that had been excluded from profit-sharing started receiving state-sponsored infrastructure, from paved roads to health clinics. State television in Bamako and Ouagadougou aired striking images, gold being melted and refined not in Switzerland but in Mali. For the first time, many citizens saw visual proof that their wealth could stay within national borders. In Burkina Faso, President Traoré promoted similar imagery by showcasing lithium projects under national supervision, presenting them as symbols of pride and independence. These acts carried immense psychological power. After decades of being told that Africans lacked the expertise to manage their own resources, the sight of Malian and Burkinabe engineers in protective gear, pouring molten gold into molds, challenged an entire narrative of dependency. Educational reforms added another layer of transformation. Mali funded programs in mining, engineering, and metallurgy at its national universities. Burkina Faso expanded vocational training for young people to work in the energy and mining sectors. For the first time, students from Timbuktu to Ouagadougou could aspire to become experts in industries that had previously been controlled from Paris or Geneva. Traoré himself often repeated in public speeches that Africa's wealth must be valued by African minds, reinforcing the belief that education was just as important as legislation. The civil atmosphere reflected both hope and uncertainty. While many families felt a renewed sense of pride, shortages of imported goods and currency fluctuations caused hardship. Inflation affected basic commodities like rice and fuel, as sanctions from European markets rippled through the region. Yet public opinion surveys and street interviews conducted by Africa news outlets revealed consistent support for the reforms. Citizens argued that temporary sacrifice was worth the long-term gain of sovereignty. A phrase began circulating on posters and murals in Bamako: "We would rather suffer in dignity than prosper in chains." This civil awakening, powered by reforms led by Goïta and supported by Traoré, demonstrated that the story of Africa's resources was no longer only about governments. It was about citizens claiming psychological ownership of their future. On the political stage, the reforms pursued by President Assimi Goïta of Mali and President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso reshaped the balance of power, both domestically and internationally. In Bamako, Goïta consolidated support by framing the mining code reforms as an act of national survival rather than a political gamble. His speeches emphasized that Mali, which depended on gold for nearly 80% of its export revenue, could no longer allow contracts signed under foreign pressure to dictate its future. By placing the state at the center of resource management, Goïta positioned himself not simply as a soldier in uniform but as a head of state, defending economic sovereignty. In Ouagadougou, Traoré mirrored this approach. Though Burkina Faso's lithium sector was still in its early stages, his policies echoed the same principles: national ownership, in-country processing, and an end to foreign dominance. This alignment transformed the relationship between Mali and Burkina Faso from simple neighbors into strategic partners. The creation of the Alliance of Sahel States, alongside Niger, gave both leaders a regional platform that magnified their voices. Rather than isolated reformers, they appeared as architects of a coordinated rebellion against the structures of dependency. Internationally, this cooperation altered the dynamics of African diplomacy. At the African Union, representatives from Mali and Burkina Faso resisted resolutions backed by Paris and Brussels that sought to impose sanctions. They argued that such measures were not about democracy but about protecting European access to resources. Their arguments resonated with leaders from Guinea, Chad, and even Senegal, who expressed sympathy for the idea of renegotiating mining contracts and reclaiming a greater share of resource wealth. The political consequences extended further into the financial sphere. The continued reliance on the CFA franc, a currency tied to the French treasury, became a lightning rod for debate. Goïta and Traoré began discussing openly the possibility of a regional currency, backed either by gold reserves or by a new African financial institution. Though still in the planning stage, the proposal signaled that these leaders were thinking beyond immediate reforms and toward structural change. Of course, risks loomed large. Both governments faced accusations of authoritarianism, while foreign-backed opposition groups gained visibility. Yet the political momentum was undeniable. For the first time in decades, leaders of Mali and Burkina Faso were not defined by dependency on Western capitals. Instead, they were defining themselves as sovereign actors capable of reshaping Africa's place in the world. From Washington's vantage point, the developments in Mali and Burkina Faso raised strategic alarms. The United States, long accustomed to shaping African policy through aid programs, military partnerships, and financial institutions, suddenly faced a new narrative. African leaders like President Assimi Goïta and President Ibrahim Traoré openly rejecting external dominance. This was not just a local political shift. For American analysts, it represented the erosion of a model that had provided predictability for decades. Think tanks in Washington published urgent policy briefs. The Council on Foreign Relations described the Alliance of Sahel States as a potentially destabilizing bloc that could undermine U.S. security partnerships in the region. The Brookings Institution warned that if Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger succeeded in rewriting mining contracts and asserting monetary independence, other African nations might follow, reducing Western leverage across the continent. The language was couched in diplomatic terms, but the underlying message was clear. The rise of Goïta and Traoré threatened American influence. The U.S. State Department responded cautiously. Official statements emphasized the need for democratic transitions and human rights. But behind the scenes, intelligence agencies monitored the growing role of non-Western partners. Russia's security agreements with Mali, Turkey's investment in Burkina Faso, and China's infrastructure deals across the Sahel became subjects of classified briefings. For Washington, the real fear was not only losing influence to African leaders, but losing Africa itself to geopolitical rivals. Economically, American companies showed hesitancy. Energy firms and technology investors worried that lithium from Burkina Faso and gold from Mali might become inaccessible under the new nationalist policies. Silicon Valley, which depends on critical minerals for electronics, quietly lobbied policymakers to secure alternative supply chains. Meanwhile, Wall Street analysts flagged the Sahel as a high-risk region, leading to divestment from certain ventures. Yet, despite the unease, some voices in the United States urged a different approach. Editorials in Africa-focused journals suggested that instead of resisting Goïta and Traoré, Washington should engage with them on equal terms, recognizing that sovereignty and dignity are not threats, but opportunities for partnership. Whether these voices will prevail remains uncertain. For now, Africa news headlines echo a truth that American officials cannot ignore. Mali and Burkina Faso, led by Goïta and Traoré, are no longer passive players. They are active agents reshaping the political and economic landscape of West Africa, and the United States must decide whether to confront this reality or adapt to it. While Washington weighed its options, Europe reacted with visible urgency. For France, the actions of President Assimi Goïta and President Ibrahim Traoré represented more than a political headache. They represented the possible unraveling of France's entire post-colonial economic system. The CFA franc, still pegged to the euro through the French treasury, depended on steady flows of African export revenue. Mali's gold, Niger's uranium, and Burkina Faso's lithium were critical not only for trade but for the stability of European currency reserves. By demanding national ownership and threatening to create a regional currency, the Sahelian leaders placed a dagger at the heart of France's economic architecture. French media outlets began portraying Goïta and Traoré as authoritarian populists, accusing them of leading their countries into chaos. The European Union echoed these claims, imposing restrictions on development funds and warning of regional instability. Yet, beneath the diplomatic language, European policymakers knew the stakes. The energy transition in Europe requires lithium for batteries, uranium for nuclear power, and gold as a financial hedge. The Sahel was no longer a distant supplier. It was becoming a strategic bottleneck. Outside the West, the response was very different. Russia expanded its military agreements with Mali, presenting itself as a guarantor of sovereignty against Western interference. China deepened economic ties, offering infrastructure investment in exchange for access to raw materials under new, state-controlled conditions. Turkey and the Gulf states positioned themselves as alternative partners, investing in security and logistics. These engagements were not framed as charity, but as trade between equals, which resonated strongly with Goïta, Traoré, and their citizens. The ripple effect extended beyond the Sahel. In Guinea, the government began renegotiating bauxite contracts. In Chad, leaders revisited oil agreements. Even in Senegal, long considered a model of Western partnership, debates erupted over gas contracts in the Atlantic. Africa news outlets described this as the domino effect of sovereignty, a phrase that captured the growing momentum of resource nationalism across the continent. Global corporations also took notice. Mining and energy lobbies in Europe and North America pushed for sanctions, fearing that an African-led shift in resource control could reduce their profits and disrupt global supply chains. But retaliation carried risks. Too much pressure might push Africa further into the arms of non-Western powers. In the end, the global perspective revealed a paradox. What France and Europe saw as instability, many in Africa saw as independence. What corporations called a threat, ordinary citizens called justice. And at the center of this historic shift stood two presidents, Assimi Goïta of Mali and Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, who were proving that Africa's resources could no longer be treated as someone else's inheritance. The most unexpected development did not come from military maneuvers or political speeches, but from quiet discussions between President Assimi Goïta of Mali and President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. In late 2024, during a joint summit of the Alliance of Sahel States, the leaders unveiled their most ambitious idea yet: the creation of a regional currency backed not by the French treasury, but by African gold reserves. The plan was audacious. For decades, the CFA franc tied Mali, Burkina Faso, and 12 other African nations to France's financial system. Every major transaction, every reserve account, every trade settlement ran through Paris. Goïta and Traoré proposed to break that cycle by pooling their gold and uranium reserves into a sovereign wealth fund that could anchor a new monetary system. By late 2024, Mali's gold reserves stood at 731 tons. Niger's uranium output was ranked among the top 5 in the world, and Burkina Faso's lithium deposits were beginning to attract global interest. Together, these assets could serve as the foundation for financial independence. International observers dismissed the announcement as symbolic, but in Bamako and Ouagadougou, the reaction was electric. Citizens flooded social media with messages of pride, while Africa news outlets described the initiative as a second independence. The idea of using gold, the very resource once stolen by empires, to now finance freedom, resonated deeply with a generation eager to reclaim dignity. For the West, this twist was more than rhetoric. It threatened to unravel decades of economic leverage. If a gold-backed Sahelian currency emerged, France and the European Union would lose one of their most reliable financial tools. And for Washington, the prospect of an African bloc trading outside the dollar system introduced new uncertainties into the global order. While President Assimi Goïta of Mali initiated the legal and financial reforms that shook the mining industry, it was President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso who transformed the movement into a living symbol. At only his mid-30s, Traoré embodied a new generation of African leadership, young, defiant, and unafraid of confronting the old powers. His fiery speeches, delivered in plain, uncompromising language, echoed across Africa news channels and social media platforms, reaching audiences far beyond the Sahel. Traoré's symbolism was not manufactured. It emerged from action. He expelled foreign military bases from Burkina Faso, redirected mining contracts toward national ownership, and aligned himself unapologetically with Mali's struggle. His youth contrasted sharply with the older, Western-backed elites who had long governed many African capitals. To ordinary citizens, Traoré represented the son or brother who refused to kneel, the leader who dared to say no. In rallies from Ouagadougou to Bamako, his face appeared on banners alongside Goïta's, the two leaders portrayed as guardians of Africa's sovereignty. Music, poetry, and street murals celebrated their alliance. Across the diaspora, particularly in Paris and New York, Burkinabe communities organized events praising Traoré's stand, describing him as the new Mansa Musa, not for his wealth, but for his refusal to be small. This symbolic rise unsettled Western policymakers even more than the economic reforms. Economic blueprints can be negotiated, but symbols are harder to silence. When Traoré declared that Africa would no longer export poverty while importing dependency, the words resonated across borders. They were quoted in editorials, debated in universities, and repeated in community meetings throughout the continent. By the end of 2024, Ibrahim Traoré was no longer seen merely as the president of Burkina Faso. He was recognized as a figurehead of a continental awakening, a reminder that Africa's story was not over, but being rewritten by those who had inherited its deepest scars. What began as a fight over contracts and royalties has become something far greater. In Mali, under the leadership of President Assimi Goïta, and in Burkina Faso, under the bold vision of President Ibrahim Traoré, a continent is rediscovering its strength. The gold beneath the Sahel is no longer just a commodity. It is a declaration that Africa will not be defined by dependency, but by dignity. For the first time in generations, young Africans see their leaders building schools with their own resources, training engineers in their own universities, and refining minerals within their own borders. This is not a return to the past, it is a rebirth, a living proof that sovereignty can be more than a word. As Goïta and Traoré stand together, the memory of Mansa Musa becomes more than history. It becomes a promise, and so, their words carry a weight we cannot ignore. We did not ask for freedom. We stood up and claimed it. If the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré touches your heart, share this story. Subscribe if you believe Africa's truth matters more than the headlines. And may God bless Mali, Burkina Faso, and a rising Africa that no longer bows its head.